Thank you. And your company has prepared a risk management plan for Willatook, which is appended to your witness statement.
That is correct.
Yes. And you've both prepared a joint witness statement for the purpose of these proceedings. Could I ask you, it might assist the inquiry to understand just how you prepared the joint statement. So did some of you write one part of the statement and someone else write another part, or did someone have a first go and the second person sort of reviewed it? How did you go about preparing your joint statement? Do you mind just briefly describing that? I don't mind who. Mr. Taylor, I'll ask you this question, perhaps.
Certainly. So the joint approach to the authoring of the expert witness statement was largely based on our particular background and experience. Yes. Obviously, Mr. Potter is more qualified in structural fire compliance, building fire suppression systems, and incorporating the built environment into a bushfire-prone setting, where my background with DELP is more in line with the operational fire conditions, fuel management, access and egress, and all the other things that come into a succinct bushfire mitigation statement. We sat together as a group and authored the plan, and dependent on the questions today, Mr. Power from the panel and others will be able to articulate to our level of experience who answers the particular theme that's being explored.
Okay, but it sounds like from your answer that sort of issues or questions relating to the bushfire fire response and suppression methods in the turbines and around the BESS and the substation, they might be questions more for Mr. Potter, if I heard, or did I mishear that?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Can I just ask you to confirm briefly the risk management plan appended to your statement? Has that been provided to CFA or anyone else, apart from Wind Prospect, of course, and this panel?
Yes, that's correct. That has been provided to CFA approximately 2 weeks ago.
Okay. And have you had a response from the CFA on this plan?
We had a response from CFA as late as yesterday, of which we're still working through the detail. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Now, you've prepared a PowerPoint. First of all, do you adopt your joint statement as the basis of your evidence in this hearing today?
I do.
Are there any other changes of opinion or corrections you wish to make to your statement?
No.
And you have a PowerPoint presentation, I believe. There's nothing new in your PowerPoint presentation which isn't already covered by your statement or the fire risk plan?
No, there isn't.
All right. Can I invite you then to take the inquiry through your PowerPoint presentation, mindful that we're trying to stick to a 20-minute time frame, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Power. And I suppose before I kick off, just to, as Mr. Taylor and Mr. Power explained, we will tag team a bit through this PowerPoint presentation, which I'll share in a second. If it assists the panel and others, certainly in our witness statement, paragraph 32 provides a bit of a guide about where the expertise between Mr. Taylor and myself. It's not exhaustive, but it's intended to give a bit of a guide about where you may find who answers which question as we progress through today. If I just share my screen. I'm hoping that comes through. Thank you. We'll kick off. So thank you to the opportunity to speak to you all today and to talk through both the outcomes of the risk management plan and the witness statement that we're prepared to talk to you today. Obviously the project proposal, we won't need to, I understand you've been going for about 7 days, so we won't talk about the specifics of the project. We'll certainly just talk about as it relates to bushfire and the work that we've done through the risk management plan. First off, the regulatory framework that we've worked to in preparation of the risk management plan and ultimately into the expert witness statement that we've prepared. They're the particular regulatory, I don't think it's completely exhaustive, but certainly they're key focus areas for us. that exist within Victoria to guide how we prepare these types of reports. Certainly clause 5232, which outlines the need to analyse bushfire risks in the surrounding area, and then into clause 1382. And we've certainly taken the view that within clause 5232, it just talks about bushfire risk is just a single statement, a single line. So certainly we take a view that clause 1382 is a far more detailed analysis of bushfire risk, and certainly by addressing 1382, it also addresses that line in clause 5232 where it talks about bushfire risk. So clause 1382 requires us to work through the assessment of landscape bushfire risk, which includes a whole range of risk indicators that are used, such as bushfire history, the types of vegetation, the landscape makeup of vegetation, and obviously we're aware that there's plantations and other native forest within the 10-kilometre range or the 20-kilometre range of the development, and we consider all those parts in terms of how we work through clause 1382. The other part is the dangerous goods storage and handling regulations, and it's because a battery does hold a battery pack does hold a dangerous good, and so therefore we have an agreement generally with the fire services in Victoria that as we work through the risk management plan, and you might see within the risk management plan there's a table on the assessment of risk relating to dangerous goods, and that's certainly to address, in addition to that, the requirements where you've got to seek advice where you achieve a certain threshold of storage, and certainly the class 9 dangerous good being lithium does exceed those figures and therefore needs to be addressed, and we do that holistically so that it's one report that covers off all those particular elements. So addressing clause 1382, we certainly did an assessment out to 1 and 10 kilometres. Certainly clause 1382 suggests other particular distances depending on the particular scenario, but certainly by our assessment, assessing the bushfire landscape risk out to 10 kilometres gave enough of an indication to indicate what the bushfire risk would likely be. And certainly the landscape to the northwest is dominated by grassland. Certainly to the southwest there is a mixture of plantations, native forest and grassland associated with farming properties, and certainly we would pick that up, and that's pretty consistent whether you assess it from 10, 20, 40 kilometres, it's all pretty well the same. And then also the bushfire planning response and settlement planning objectives. Obviously, this is not a settlement. However, we see clause 1382 as a best practice approach, and we use that as a guide to work out the way through. We also utilise the CFA guidelines, and that's a significant part of the risk management plan. And we certainly, a number of the recommendations that will come out of the assessment of risk using the risk management plan and then into the eventual fire management plan documentation is certainly related back to what the CFA guidelines are proposing that should be implemented to manage that risk, and we've certainly followed that. We'll also use the Australasian Fire Authorities Council, which is largely an industry body representing the fire agencies of Australia. We use their guideline as well, just as another tool to assess where the risk currently sits. And certainly, as you can see there, there's a range of risk reduction strategies that we've certainly utilised to assist with managing the risk associated with this development. And then the existing conditions assessment. So we've certainly conducted the site visit and started to analyse a range of indicators that talk about bushfire risk. There is no doubt that there is bushfire history in the surrounding landscape. According to the available data, it doesn't indicate bushfire history on this particular site. But certainly we can see that there are some large grass fire in particular events that occurred in that part of the state, which is quite consistent with the western side of the state. And we're certainly aware that there's been a number of fire ignitions, have occurred in proximity to the Proteus wind farm, as they do in that part of the world. In particular, along roadsides, we see a spike in types of fire ignitions, and we certainly know that that's there. But we also acknowledge that there's a range of, and this is outlined within the risk management plan, there's a range of existing treatments, including fuel breaks, community education, provision and maintenance of access roads and the like, and we can certainly see that there's evidence of that in the surrounding landscape, but certainly listed within various plans that are maintained by the agencies.
Thanks, Mr. Potter. Part of the detailed assessment of risk which sits within the RMP has been the development of essentially bushfire risk treatment strategies, mitigation strategies. Just a very brief overview. We acknowledge that the fire ignition management, and we're talking specifically about the likelihood of a fire occurring, is an important way of being able to manage risk on site. We know that if we can stop a fire occurring, then that fire, of course, won't start and spread. We also know that if a fire occurs, if we can manage it to a smaller area, it's less likely to leave the wind farm footprint. We know in Western Victoria that intensive farming agricultural fragmentation is useful in limiting fire spread, and that's due to the breakup of the landscape into cropping, agricultural management zones, grazing areas, areas of reduced fuel post-harvest in the cropping districts. And we know that from a fire protection and suppression point of view, that's often an opportunity to stop fires before they get up and run. Industry best practice now within wind turbines and the nacelle is the installation of fire and smoke detection systems and suppression systems. We have gone into a fair bit of detail with that within the risk management plan. We know that these are large structures and the nacelle will be a long way off the ground. So the opportunity to have an early detection method in terms of pickup of an issue, and then importantly linked to that is should a fire occur in the nacelle, that there is a suppression system which can be operated, which will contain that fire. Always in the southeastern Australia and the bushfire risk context, we'd love to see separation distance between assets and infrastructure and the bushfire fuel. We know that where there's separation distance, there's certainly less bushfire impacts on structures. We know that it's less likely for a structure to fail if it's only exposed to embers compared to being exposed to radiant heat or direct flame contact. And that's where the value of asset protection zones and defendable space comes in. And also a large part of the RMP deals with the risk management and emergency management planning framework. There'll obviously be a detailed emergency management plan developed by the proponent, and a key part of that will be consultation with the CFA. And by that, we mean consultation not only state level, but also region and district level, and with the local resources as well. Some of the other best practice design solutions that have been recommended through the RMP, we've mentioned about asset protection systems and detection system suppression. The ability to be able to shut down the turbines instantly is an important measure, particularly as we talk about later in the presentation with the aviation and aerial firefighting assets. Improved road access across the network. There will be roads and tracks constructed that will be utilised for the construction phase of the project, but also from an operational point of view, they maintain an important access to the asset for the life of the asset. And they're also, in our experience, heavily utilised during a fire scenario for gaining better access to the fire, in a more timely manner. Wind farm staff will be trained in first attack firefighting, and will have resources available that they can, provide a primary response to any incident. Mark will talk, Mr. Potter will talk in detail about the BESS and some of the early alerts that can be used to define issues within the BESS. 24/7 monitoring. It's important to acknowledge that with the complex nature of the technology that does need to be monitored 24/7, and particularly our conversations with CFA to date have been about how that monitoring will work and the mechanism to make sure there's an early intervention should an issue arise. And also a positive thing we're seeing with the proposed development will be an increase in static water across the landscape. And by static water, we're talking about water that's available to the firefighting resources on site that'll be located strategically across the project footprint.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor. So in relation to the nacelle fire safety design, so obviously the CFA guideline makes a number of recommendations around the fire safety within the nacelle. It's seen that there have been historical fires within nacelles, and certainly through our experience, the technology is improving. The reduction in combustible materials is occurring, and certainly utilising as much non-combustible oils as well is being seen across the industry. So there is a definitely focus on reducing the combustible materials in there. However, we acknowledge that there's electrical installations that still historically may cause a threat. So certainly the CFA guideline suggests a range of things, and a lot of this is focused on ensuring that we don't start bushfires or reducing the potential for bushfires to occur. Lightning conductors are standard requirements now within wind turbines. They'll be fitted to reduce both the turbine damage and the bushfire risk. The turbines will be fitted with smoke detection and suppression systems. They'll be monitored through the SCADA system, so the monitoring system 24/7, and obviously have a range of systems in place whereby they'll commence shutdown procedures upon certain triggers. So whether it be certainly gas suppression system activation would likely result in an immediate shutdown of the turbine, whereas a smoke detector may warrant some checks, and then if it's triggered, if the smoke retains for a period of time, the system's smart enough to then make those decisions to commence that shutdown. But obviously, the control room also has the ability to trigger that shutdown as well. And that covers off the standard operating procedures. We certainly have the asset protection zone that was specified under the turbines that must be kept free of flammable material. And then regular preventative maintenance inspections will occur, and obviously records are maintained to prove that those maintenance checks have occurred. In relation to the battery system, there's also a number of recommendations. The requirements for batteries has increased significantly with the release of the CFA guideline in, I think, March this year. Certainly that was triggered by a reasonably large fire that occurred in the state of Victoria, and certainly CFA have increased their expectations around how we manage the risk associated with battery systems. That's certainly been implemented for this development, and CFA have come forward, which was already included within the risk management plan, about the types of water supplies. So just over 500,000 litres of water will be available for firefighting use at the best, including asset protection zones, perimeter access roads. And then depending on the chosen technology supplier, there are some suppliers that, and this has obviously occurred previously with the likes of CFA, some suppliers have increased sensor type systems. Other suppliers will utilise smoke detection, so fire suppression type systems. So there is a final sort of process in finalising the risk management plan once the technology supply has been determined to then progress through and finalise the risk assessment to ensure that technology supply fits in this type of arena. But certainly the technology suppliers have all been supported by CFA in the past. And then the final one is just the UL 9540. It's a United Laboratories standard, which is a not-for-profit organisation out of the US, and it's a test requirement. The batteries do undergo fire testing to demonstrate their compliance with that standard, and that occurs quite regularly.
Probably the most common issue we see raised with wind farm developments across Australia is perceived issues with aircraft, both rotary aircraft, helicopters, and fixed wing, and the perceived ideas that aircraft can't effectively work around a wind farm during a fire, or that in actual fact the towers impede aircraft operations. Certainly with our assessment on this project and others, we've been able to identify that aircraft can work safely around wind turbines. They do provide safe systems of work. Every pilot undertakes a dynamic risk assessment in Australia before they drop a load of water, retardant, or foam. The towers are are essentially just another aerial obstacle that the pilots must navigate round. And certainly we've seen numerous examples in Australia over the last few years where aircraft have been able to undertake effective fire suppression operations through wind farms. Now that's obviously aligned to good management systems and practices. The turbines being the blades being stowed in the Y position, every turbine being stowed in a similar position that allows the pilots clear access, and also the way that aircraft are managed, and we can talk about this in some detail later, but the way the aircraft are managed will mean that there is multiple checks and balances in place before aviation fire suppression gets underway, and we can certainly talk to that later. It's important to point out that from our assessment already within the local landscape, there is significant fire prevention effort being employed by the agencies. CFA and Forest Fire Management conduct fire prevention activities, including prescribed burning in local area, particularly on roadsides. Forest Fire Management have several large burns planned on the surrounding public land estate. Certainly they're not in proximity to the wind farm, but it will help reduce the impacts of landscape bushfire events. We know that Victoria Police, through their operations, their active operations over summer, undertake a rigorous patrolling and assessment of known and likely threats, and particularly targeting arson activity and offences under the Crimes Act. And we also understand that in Western Victoria there is great collaboration between the agencies to make sure that the things that I've mentioned are incorporated and actually done as part of a programmed approach, and not just being completed ad hoc.
So in addition to Mr. Taylor's comments around the existing arrangements, certainly we see through this development the additional bushfire risk mitigation outcomes that will be implemented, in particular the extensive road access, the construction of asset protection zones around the turbines, the BESS and the other buildings, will all create an increased level of fragmentation within the landscape, and will certainly assist with any fire activity that might occur in the surrounding landscape and runs through the footprint. It will also assist with managing the risk of fire ignition, and that's an important aspect as well in terms of demonstrating that the infrastructure won't contribute to fire risk, or in particular ignition risk, and certainly the asset protection zones, the numerous policies and procedures around hot works and other ignition sources, such as driving vehicles off the tracks during the fire danger period, and all those other aspects that are considered will ensure that we reduce the risk of igniting a fire in the landscape. And then we've already talked about the NASA and the battery packs. The final slide to talk to is just in relation to draft planning permit conditions. So we've certainly reviewed the proposed conditions that CFA have provided, which I think are listed as 53 to 55 of the draft planning permit conditions. Our view is that these are certainly consistent with the requirements outlined within CFA's guideline. It also requires a risk management plan to be developed in consultation with them. So certainly a risk management plan that's provided attached to the expert witness statement will be updated following some other decisions that are made, design decisions that come out of this process, but also the feedback we received from CFA yesterday, which was largely limited to just the assessment of risk relating to dangerous goods, and was just a minor variation to the outcome of that risk assessment. And we don't see that as any significant change to report. And they've indicated in principle they were fairly comfortable, but they get another go through the planning panel process to finalise their feedback. All the treatments and recommendations are then captured up into the fire management plan. The fire management plan largely becomes the document that outlines everything that the wind farm and the BESS operators need to do in both through construction and operations. And then obviously the emergency management plan, which will be driven by compliance with the Australian standard, but also the CFA guideline, including a whole range of other activities that are required to mitigate and treat the risk of bushfire. Thank you. That brings us to a close. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Potter. That's 55 seconds over the 20 minutes. Not bad. No further questions from me, sir.
Thank you. And we do have a little bit of a grace period, so it's all good. I just want to see who seeks to ask questions of Mr. Taylor and Mr. Potter. I'll start with Moyne Shire Council, just an indication of time.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I would say approximately 20 minutes.
Thank you. Any other parties seeking to ask questions? I'll be asking questions on behalf of the IAP at the end. So we'll start with Moyne Shire Council. So thank you, Ms. Marshall.
Mr. Chairman. I'm just observing that the position of the CFA in relation to the permit application is that I understand they're not a referral authority. They did make a submission in relation to pursuant to section 52 in relation to the proposal. That submission was dated the 5th of August 2022, or 5th of August 2022. To the extent that it appears that there might be more recent advice from the CFA that has been referred to in evidence, it would be helpful for parties and the IAP to have access to that document so that we can address it either in submissions or it's difficult to do it on the run.
No, it's totally understood. I was hoping we'd have been able to table it by now, Ms. Marshall. We just wanted as a courtesy to reach out to the author of the document at CFA to make sure they were okay with that, but that's completely understood. Sorry for interrupting.
All right, that's fine. To the extent that there might be issues that are raised in that document, we'll reserve the right either to raise those in our submission or at another appropriate juncture. Okay, if I start first with Mr. Taylor and take you to paragraph 16 of the witness statement, in that you've indicated that your team has assessed bushfire risk on numerous renewable energy projects across Australia, including wind, solar and battery storage facilities. Is the reason for the reference to your team an indication that you haven't been involved in assessment of bushfire risk on renewable energy projects before?
In terms of me personally, Ms. Marshall, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, both Mark and I lead the renewable energy portfolio within Fire Risk Consultants. So Fire Risk has, 20 odd staff members working in 3 separate portfolios, but in terms of the renewable energy projects for Fire Risk, I've been involved in all of them. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, and when you say renewable energy projects,
Yeah.
are they are some of those projects wind energy facilities?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and to the extent that you've been involved in wind energy facilities, where have those facilities been located?
Victoria, South Australia.
Just focusing on the Victorian one. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Taylor. You can finish your sentence if you like.
Yeah, certainly. We've been involved in the Delburn wind farm project here in Gippsland.
Mm-hmm.
The Mumblin wind farm project. I'm sorry, I haven't got an exhaustive list. I can certainly provide that. The Mumblin wind farm based in Western Victoria, and this project as well. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So is it fair to say that you don't have any experience in relation to any of the cluster of wind farms that we've been discussing in the course of this hearing that are located within the Moyne Shire?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And Mr. Potter, can I ask you the same question as well in relation to your paragraph, the paragraph 28 in the evidence report? You've also indicated experience in relation to renewable energy bushfire assessments. If I cut to the chase, what experience do you have in relation to Victorian wind farm proposals and in this municipality?
So specific to the municipality, no.
Well, perhaps Victoria and then
okay.
specific to the
So
municipality.
certainly similar to Mr. Taylor, certainly the two that he's mentioned. In addition to that, Mr. Taylor's forgotten about the Kentbrook Wind Farm down in the far southwest that we've also been involved with as well. But in specific to mine, no. We're trying to think through the landscape. Not sure whether Mumbling fits within mine. I don't think it does. I think it's Corangamite.
I don't think it does. Yeah.
So it's in the next door neighbour. So no. No, so that would be the extent of the projects we've been involved in relation to wind farms.
Okay. All right. So I'm not sure which of you is best placed to answer this question. So I'll put it, and then between the two of you, you can direct who is best to deal with it. I observe that both of you have had significant experience in relation to state bureaucracies that deal with fire issues, including the department and the CFA, but you've both also, as I recall, indicated that you've had experience as volunteers in local brigades. The material that's been tabled so far in relation to the CFA has come from I think it's hard to tell because the a version of the submission that I've got is redacted, but it appears to come from a central part of CFA in relation to exercising its functions under the Planning and Environment Act. To what extent have you already had any engagement in relation to this matter in dealing with the local brigades of the CFA in preparing the work that you've undertaken in relation to this matter?
We've had no involvement with local CFA brigades. So the accepted practice within CFA is that we deal with the central unit, as you outlined, that is based centrally. And on previous projects, it's up to them with the local leadership within the particular district of CFA that's responsible for that area to then engage directly with the CFA brigades and have those conversations. We've certainly offered to participate in those, and occasional times we might participate, but otherwise generally CFA manages that in-house.
Okay, so when you say that you've offered to participate in those discussions between, for want of a better term, head office and the local brigades, that's been pursuant a discussion that occurs under the auspices of the head office of the CFA, rather than there being direct engagement. Is that the evidence that you've given?
I'm not sure I understood the question, Ms. Marshall.
I was just confirming that where you said that you'd participated in discussions, or you'd offered to participate in discussions between the head office and local brigades. Is that what you're saying is that occurs under the auspices of the CFA head office rather than being an engagement that you can drive directly?
That's correct, yeah. So certainly the expectation on us is to engage directly with CFA through their headquarters, and then they'll facilitate any discussions that need to occur.
Okay. The feedback that I've had from council in relation to fire issues associated with wind farms and putting together plans and those things is that there is a sense that much of what needs to be dealt with fire risk management is based on what happens locally in relation to things like water supply, access routes, processes for local CFA brigades to become, to familiarise themselves with arrangements on particular sites and the like, and that there's a disengagement between the local brigades and the CFA. Is that your experience of what occurs, and what is it appropriate to try to address that, and if so, how? I know there's 3 questions in there.
Mr. Potter, I might try and unpack that if we can. It's important to point out, Ms. Marshall, that there's 1,200 volunteer brigades across Victoria, and the makeup of those brigades and their knowledge of renewable energy or critical infrastructure processes and infrastructure is quite different depending on where they are in the Victorian landscape. We've found in our experience with the projects we've been on that it's entirely appropriate for CFA to manage that engagement with the brigades. We've certainly on other projects been involved in detailed discussions later on in the project with the local brigades and assisted with some pre-planning, but at this stage of the process, our experience has always been that the CFA as an organisation own the guideline, but that sits within a specialist unit within headquarters, and they have the ability to go and engage with the local districts and regions and also down to brigade level. And I suppose I'll just add, Mr. Marshall, that it wouldn't be appropriate for us as consultants to reach out to local brigades because we're not responsible for the prevention or the planning or how those brigades conduct their business operations. That's purely a question for CFA.
Thank you. Sorry. Just a moment, Richard. Just if I can unpack a little bit more of that. Firstly, you referred to it being appropriate for the CFA head office to deal with these issues because they've got a lot of the expertise in relation to renewable energy facilities and dealing with planning permit processes. Mm-hmm. I guess the situation is slightly different here in that there is an existing agglomeration of wind energy facilities in this location, and the question is, how do we, as part of the planning process, take account of and bring to the table that experience of the local brigades here in dealing with the planning for future facilities?
I'd suggest, Ms. Marshall, that CFA would apply planning based on essentially the 3 levels of planning: strategic, operational and tactical. So brigades responding to a fire near a wind facility or a renewable energy project, as you suggest, would benefit from pre-planning in terms of how to respond, what the particular risks are, the best way to access the fire, who to call, but all that is developed through the emergency management planning framework. And as we've mentioned, this facility will require a detailed emergency management plan. We utilise the specialist risk knowledge that sits within CFA to guide us through as you've seen, the development of the risk management plan. But certainly, we would fully expect that CFA would engage with the local brigades, at a later stage through the project in terms of how they capture knowledge for the existing wind farms. We work in multiple jurisdictions, and every fire agency has a different way of doing that. but that lessons learned stuff that you're talking about would be a question best referred to CFA.
Okay. For what it's worth, I'm not suggesting for a minute that it would be appropriate for you to deal directly with the local brigade, but I'm just wanting to understand how that knowledge and experience of the locals is brought to account. And I understand that what you're saying is that you would expect that would happen at a later stage. And what you're saying is that later stage is at the stage of preparation of the detailed emergency management plan. Is that
that's normally the stage
when that happens?
Where that would happen. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Just take the opportunity, Ms. Marshall, if that's okay, just to contribute to the answer. So I think we've also got to recognise that CFA only up until about 5 years ago didn't have a guideline. We didn't have a position in relation to wind farms and solar farms and batteries. So I think it would be fair to say, and I'm probably being a bit biased here as a former volunteer as a volunteer up until recently, there are systems in place whereby that feedback does generate a change in practice. So certainly the obligations that are on a wind farm, solar farm or battery operator today is significantly different to what might have been in place 5-10 years ago. So, and I think that would directly relate back to the influence of volunteers, whether it's specifically in the mine show, I can't tell you, but certainly there would be some influencing factors in the development of that guideline.
Okay. The report that you've prepared refers to the turbines, towers, access roads, terminal station, and the battery storage. Does it also cover the quarry component of this proposal?
No, it doesn't, because it's our understanding that will be covered through the Earth Resources regulatory process. So certainly we're aware that they will require additional assessments and plans in place. Whether that all encompasses under the one, that's yet to be decided. But certainly that's my experience that's how that would be managed.
Okay. A question that has been raised by council officers in the context of the scale and size of wind farms, where you've got turbines obviously located over a considerable area, and also on multiple addresses, how you deal with the question of directing emergency resources to the appropriate location in terms of addresses and those sorts of things. The analogy that the council officers made with me was in circumstances where you might have a retirement village with multiple separate occupancies but a single address.
Certainly my experience, Ms. Marshall, is on other planning permits that have been issued through DELP. Is there's a condition in there that talks about the requirement to provide that information, and I'm no technical expert on this, but provide information to a central repository within the Victorian State Government. I think it sits within DELP, who manage the spatial data for the state government. And that is for the sole purpose of enabling as much detail as possible to be located on maps for emergency services. So I would expect data such as turbine numbers, GPS locations, and other data would be welcomed. And as I indicated, I have seen that as a condition of other planning permits within renewable energy installations.
Okay. The wind energy facilities that are being approved often have a reasonably long lifespan of 25 years or so, and in that forward period, we're obviously anticipating an increase in extreme weather conditions as a consequence of climate change. What arrangements in those circumstances should be put in place for review of fire risk management plans going forward?
So
I assume it's not a set and forget system.
Definitely not. So there's certainly within the fire management plan, there is a requirement that when the fire management plan is developed in accordance with the CFA guidelines, there are certainly requirements in there to in previous experience to satisfy CFA's requirements to clearly articulate that there will be ongoing reviews. So there's clearly a whole range of maintenance obligations such as vegetation management, maintaining access roads, fire suppression systems, detection systems. All those things need to be maintained in accordance with something. Certainly the fire management plan, at this stage, we've been recommending a review every 3 years. That seems to be accepted by the agencies, the fire agencies, I should say, and certainly I would expect that would be a key input into that consideration. And if we do move into another dry spell, then that would certainly influence the increased requirements to better manage vegetation or increase focus on vegetation than what may be occurring if it was this year. Yep.
Okay, so what you'd anticipate is that review process would deal both with the review of the fire risk management plans, but also any fire-related infrastructure and provision for servicing and maintenance of that equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. I would expect that to be the case, yes.
Okay, at paragraph 65 in your expert evidence, you've referred to the complexity of the flying environment with a mix of high voltage power transmission lines, distribution lines to individual or groups of properties, and natural hazards such as large dead trees in paddocks. To what extent could you reduce some of that risk by undergrounding the transmission line associated with this proposal?
Certainly, we'd consider, Ms. Marshall, the complex environment of flying in Western Victoria no more complex to other parts of the state. Your question about the proponent putting the power line underground, I presume that you're suggesting that would negate the risk in that particular location. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I'm just talking about I'm not sure you can ever negate the risk, but the extent to which undergrounding of the transmission line might contribute to a reduction in risk in what you've described as a complex environment.
I'd probably suggest, Ms. Marshall, that it would remove one aviation hazard that pilots had to negotiate around, but similarly, as we've suggested in the expert witness statement, there are hundreds of aerial hazards in the local area that pilots would need to navigate around. Yeah.
Okay. You've talked about the complexity of the flying environment, and I understood you to say a moment ago that the complexity of that environment was in this location is similar to the environment in other locations. In making that assessment of the complexity of the flying environment, have you taken into account the agglomeration of wind energy facilities in this location and the cumulative impact of multiple turbines on that flying environment?
Yeah, absolutely. We've certainly had some discussions as a team about that. And as you suggest, there are numerous other wind energy facilities within your council footprint. We're certainly not seeing any prohibitive factors to aviation operations in the area, other than the amount of aerial hazards that currently exist. And by that, we're talking about not only the transmission lines, the distribution lines into the single farms and isolated properties that you see around the site. They're certainly dangerous. The single lines are certainly more dangerous than large transmission towers. They don't stand out from an aviation suppression point of view. Often it's a single line into a remote or rural property. Obviously, the power poles of the infrastructure are much shorter. It's been our experience, Ms. Marshall, that the larger the infrastructure, the more opportunity there is for pilots to identify it, catalogue it, and certainly work around it from a fire suppression point of view.
I guess the question I was particularly asking you was, in circumstances where we've got a series of wind farms that are already in existence, and then other wind farms that have been approved, and then another set of wind farms that are up for approval, at what point does that agglomeration of wind turbines and other facilities associated with them make that the complexity of that flying environment difficult to navigate in a way that has an impact on the fire safety of the general area?
I'll probably answer that, Ms. Marshall, with it. I certainly haven't come across, in my experience, times when fire suppression has been impeded large scale based off aerial obstacles or obstacles in the landscape. The value that we've got within Victoria and the 70 odd aircraft that are available every summer is that there's an opportunity to employ multiple firefighting aircraft and types of aircraft on a fire. And I realise this is probably getting very, very technical, but in some parts of the state, helicopters are more effective based off the terrain, the vegetation type, and the amount of aerial hazards that are around, compared to crop dusting aircraft, fire bombers, that operate in the far west of the state where you've got large open expanses of grassland. So I would suggest that the type of aircraft available and the options available to incident managers, that they would choose the most appropriate aircraft to respond to the fire and the conditions on the day. And certainly the pilots that we work with that fly regularly around wind farm towers don't see them as an increased aerial hazard for them or risk. It's purely about knowing that the hazard's there and then working around it. Ms. Marshall, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So if this was an area that before the wind farm agglomeration might have been the sort of open rural landscape situation that you described in Western Victoria, as a consequence of an increase in the number of tall structures because you've got this collection of wind farms, what might be the appropriate aerial vehicle for firefighting might shift to being a helicopter. That's the evidence that you're giving, isn't it?
That's one of the options that are open to incident managers, Ms. Marshall. I would also add that the majority of the aircraft that operate in Western Victoria, and I'm mindful that the fleet in Victoria is completely interchangeable, the majority of the aircraft that operate in Western Victoria operate based off that landscape, if I can describe it like that. So open grassland is suitable for fixed wing firebombing aircraft and rotary helicopters with belly tanks. Now, I can't see that, based off my experience, I can't see that assessment changing, but as I'd suggested, it would purely come down to the operational conditions on the day, what the smoke's doing, what the visibility's like, where the fire is going, what type of vegetation is burning. And there's so many factors within that before you drop a load of water or retardant, Ms. Marshall, that I certainly can't speak for the pilots.
Yeah, okay. All right. So in addition to the collection of wind turbines that's contemplated in this area, we're also, with this wind farm, have a relatively proximate commercial plantation close to the site. To what extent is it appropriate, and or has it already been done, to have regard to emergency or fire risk management of the plantations in conjunction with the fire risk and management on the wind farm site?
I might let Mr. Potter answer that with his CFA experience of forestry industry brigades.
So certainly, sorry, Ms. Marshall, I think I understand. So certainly there's, as we outlined in the presentation, we certainly acknowledge there's a variation in the landscape, in particular the southwest of the development. And we're certainly aware that the southwest can contribute to some significant fire behaviour, as has occurred in the Western districts on a number of occasions in the past. And certainly, do we see the development of the wind farm providing an impact on the ability for the plantation to manage their forests? No, certainly the plantation has an extensive a range of responsibilities under the CFA legislation through the forest, and I would expect they'd be declared as a forestry industry brigade, and they have to demonstrate to CFA on a regular basis how they both prevent and suppress fires, and maintain their capacity to do that. I think our view is that we're actually seeing some risk reduction by the introduction of the wind farm, in that we're actually introducing an increasingly fragmented landscape. So certainly under elevated fire danger conditions, as we know, not much stops those types of bushfires, but certainly under lower conditions where we can see fires travel through the landscape, the addition of access roads and asset protection zones will actually slow, in some cases make stop, or will assist firefighters with additional landscape features to make a decision about whether they can undertake a direct attack on a fire edge rather than waiting until the fire comes out of the paddock to the next road.
Okay. We heard earlier in the week from the landscape and visual impact assessment witness who described the use of vegetative screening on sometimes on the site and sometimes on private land to mitigate visual impacts and to screen industrial elements of the wind farm. To what extent does the work that you've undertaken take that into account in assessing bushfire risk?
So certainly we haven't considered that at this stage of the project. It would be a consideration if the CFA conditions are implemented in terms of the risk management plan, and certainly we would assist with the assessment of risk. However, our experience is on other projects that have undertaken this, that largely the planting to create a visual interruption is sometimes a single or a small group of trees or some shrubs, depending on the closeness of the property and all those sort of aspects. And certainly we've participated in assisting with assessing the risk, but often a single tree or a single shrub doesn't constitute a bushfire risk in our experience in most cases. And certainly we can see that providing that visual screening is often some distance from the plantation, from the wind farm development, that it doesn't alter the landscape or the local risk in any way in too much of a factor at all.
Okay, so is it a fair summary of that to say that there may be an increased risk associated with additional vegetation, but it will depend upon the extent of that vegetation and where it's located in proximity to, for instance, someone's house or something like that?
Yeah, I apologise. I think I was saying the opposite. And I'm just trying to clarify that better. So my experience is no, it doesn't. My experience is that in most cases it's a single or two trees or a single shrub or two shrubs is the solution to fix that visual amenity, and in particular in that sort of country where the landscape is driven by farming properties, we haven't yet experienced it on very many occasions whereby we would see an increase in risk. I'm not saying there can't be. It's obviously a location by location assessment, but certainly we haven't seen a significant increase or any increase in risk in any way.
So in preparing your evidence, did you have regard to the landscape and visual impact assessment material that's been put before the panel?
No, we didn't.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to check on page 30 of your risk
Sorry, Ms. Marshall, you just cut out. Can you hear me, Ms. Marshall? Can anyone else hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll just see if I get her attention. Marshall, Ms. Marshall. We can't. Sorry, Ms. Marshall, can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry.
We couldn't hear anything you said at all. The whole
Okay.
lot.
All right. I'm not sure what happened. Let me go.
You just cut it again.
On page 30.
Pause. I think when you cut out, you can't hear us either. So you just cut out again then.
Yes. Just if you can just give me a moment. I'm hoping that that will fix it. The issue is I think that we're running another hearing and I suspect there's trouble in that hearing and I'm getting a lot of phone calls. So my apologies, but I hope I've fixed it now. All right, so if I can go back to the question, just on page 30 of the risk management report, in reference to the fire hydrant system for battery energy storage systems, you say that there's reticulated water supply in the vicinity of the battery. Is that correct, or is that missing and there is no reticulated water system? It seems to proceed on the basis that you'll be proceeding on the basis of static water supplies.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, for picking up that typo. So that's correct. There is no reticulated, and we're missing the word no. So there is no reticulated water supply in the vicinity of the BESS. Hence, we're using the second option.
Okay, thank you. All right, on page 36, you refer to an emergency management plan being developed for both construction and operation phases, but you haven't really outlined what will be the elements of that emergency management plan and what it needs to cover.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Marshall. So traditionally, the fire management plan is the one that encapsulates all the feedback. So the risk management plan is a document that we do to justify that we're addressing all these things. Certainly, I probably could have added that, in accordance with the CFA guideline and the Australian Standard 3745, which both provide guidance around how we develop emergency management plans within these types of facilities. The emergency management plan will encapsulate the traditional emergency management plan concepts that you might have in the buildings you're operating. There'll be an emergency control organisation, there'll be chief wardens and deputy wardens, and that'll all be related back to the way that the wind farms operated and how that works. But more importantly, for the emergency management plan for this type of development, it will include the activities that would occur by wind farm and BESS staff and contractors on elevated days. So we would use the Australian Fire Danger Rating System, which has recently been re-released under the 4 categories, and certainly use that to drive a number of conversations around how people would operate. So we would be pretty confident that in consultation with CFA, which is part of the draft planning permit conditions, that we wouldn't get a fire management plan or an emergency management plan past CFA unless we clearly articulated no operational activities other than emergency activities or maintenance requirements on days such as catastrophic and above, and even some serious limitations on what can occur on days that are forecast to be extreme. We would need to be clearly specifying some restrictions on what activities could occur on those particular days, and then a whole range of other prevention preparedness activities as well, including training, exercising, and other functions that would be in that plan.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. The IEP hasn't got that many questions, but for OHS reasons, we will take a break. Because it's a short day, it'll just be a short break till 11:30, unless anyone needs a longer time. So we'll recommence at 11:30. Thank you. Just wait to see everyone on the screen. Thank you. Mr. Potter, Ms. Taylor, this has been working quite well, having both of you here concurrently. So what I'll do is I'll just ask questions, and I'm happy for you to decide who will respond. I'd like to ask obvious questions just for confirmation, because sometimes the obvious may not be so obvious. The first is regarding your evidence in section 5, being PDF, page 35. There's an attachment there. You refer to clause 1302. I take it clause 1302 of the plan scheme is not applicable here because the proposer is not proposing to introduce new settlement. That's your position?
Mr. Chair, great question, and I'm not sure we'd have a position because I think it differentiates depending on the project. But what I was trying to indicate earlier during the presentation, that we use clause 1302 as a benchmark and as a tool to assess a project, acknowledging that it does talk to settlement, but it is an opportunity to run a particular development through that assessment. And ignoring the term settlement to ensure that we've considered the, in particular, the landscape risk assessment aspect.
Thank you. And the bushfire management overlay does not apply to, I'll say, virtually all of the subject land. There might be a little bit of it, but generally the bushfire management overlay doesn't apply here.
Yeah, that's correct. So that's certainly some conversations we had with the developer in the early days that they had already ensured the turbines were not located within the bushfire management overlay, and certainly I haven't got the map in front of me, but certainly down in the plantation in the I suppose the western end of the development that it sits close to that. But certainly we've ensured that those turbines are outside the bushfire management overlay.
Thank you. Because I ask these just as a matter of context, because your fire plan has to respond within the context it's in. So I take it then, I'll just share my screen. I take it then, what we're talking here is a bushfire prone area. That's the response you're preparing in your plan. And
that's correct.
Just for those following, just as context, you can see oh no, I should share it first. You see my on the screen there, a map of Victoria.
Yes, have it now.
So,
yes.
So your understanding, this is Vic plan. This is where our wonderful planning information, associated information gets mapped. All the brown area, you see in the legend here, bushfire prone areas. What we're talking about here is no different to most of Victoria. Like the whole Victoria is that bushfire prone.
That's correct. The only areas of Victoria that are not bushfire prone are largely the centre of medium to large towns.
Thank you. If we just zoom in a little bit further into Willatook, got a little bit off. Let's go back in here. Excuse me, let's get my question here. There is, not sure I can see my questions there. You still see the map?
Yes, you can see the map.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good, I got my question over here. The environmental management framework includes a landscape and vegetation action 3 regarding relating to dwellings within 6 kilometres of a turbine. It's saying the requirements of a bushfire management overlay, where applicable, maintain a 20-metre buffer between any landscape mitigation planting and existing landscape, and a 10-metre buffer from the residents. You aware of that?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Thank you. I take it from there, this is Tyrone North Road. I take it by that there's no bushfire management overlay here, so there's no issue why we couldn't have mitigation planting, so screening along any property on this road. You don't see any issue?
No, because as you're right, that the only challenge you'll have is you can undertake planting that may trigger in the future a bushfire management overlay, but certainly the Victorian Government Practice Note, I think it's 64, and the Australian Standard 3959 does provide some guidance about how you may undertake that planting and providing sufficient separation at various stages just to ensure that the vegetation replanting doesn't result in a bushfire management overlay in the future when that reassessment occurred.
Yeah. Thank you. And you very nicely led to the next question I had, which was just about that. How can we ensure that we don't, in the next remapping of the plan scheme, next review, trigger the need for bushfire management overlay from the vegetation? So you're referring to guidance in planning practice note 64?
Yeah, absolutely. So that provides that guidance. And as I said, there's certainly exclusion statements that are utilised quite regularly within Australian Standard 3959 that guides that. So to ensure that there's breaks in a linear stretch or a particular size of vegetation that's not going to trigger that. So certainly that's work we've done in the past with other clients to ensure that you're not increasing bushfire risk, but still increasing native vegetation back in the landscape.
Thank you. And just if you know on top of your head, do you know roughly the meterage or depth of vegetation before it triggers bushfire management overlay or consideration of it?
So the practice note and the guidance from the state starts to talk around the 4 hectare type size. There are a range, that's a very simplistic view. There are a range of other triggers about the close proximity of 2 blocks of 2 hectares, all those sort of aspects to consider, but generally there's a 4 to 5 hectare sort of trigger before you start to have the algorithm start to consider that we need to have a closer look at this vegetation, determine whether it should be bushfire management overlay.
Thank you. In your Annexure C of your evidence statement on PDF 17, happy to share this as well. In response to submission number 7, there appeared to be a general, firefighting in these rocky volcanic areas is already extremely prohibitive. And you respond to that here. I'm just wondering, first of all, are you talking generally here about the area, not specifically about the subject land?
We're talking generally about the mention of the rocky volcanic areas. We're certainly aware of that country in parts of the southwest of the state that, for a range of reasons can create difficulties for firefighters when they need to attempt to suppress a fire within that landscape. So certainly it's just in a general comment that's acknowledging the submission statement.
How about specific to the subject land? Do you consider the subject land to have a challenging terrain for firefighting access?
Might hand to Mr. Taylor for that one.
I had a couple of days on site, Mr. Chair, reviewing the landscape in detail and looking at the access roads and egress, and from a fire response scenario, how we think the suppression scenarios would play out. I certainly don't consider the landscape any more difficult from an active fire suppression point of view as other parts of Western Victoria. Your question regarding the rocky outcrops, there are areas of rock across the development area, but I certainly don't see those impeding fire suppression compared to, say, an area like the Stony Rises near Colac, which is all rock and makes on-ground fire suppression incredibly difficult. So we certainly don't see the topographical features or the rock that's present in the landscape stopping active suppression, on-ground suppression anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. You've answered questions regarding aerial firefighting, so I won't repeat that. So in terms of that last response, you don't see any issue with, well, I shouldn't say any issue, sorry, let me withdraw that. There's nothing of note regarding the ground crew fighting a fire on this site that we should be alarmed about.
No, I think the main factors that will drive the fire response is purely the vegetation change, Mr. Chair. The fact that you've got plantation out to the west, the Shaw River, which runs through the northern and western part. From a fire suppression point of view, it's often hard to get fire trucks and ground resources from one side of a river to the other. Features like that, but certainly no, nothing that stands out.
Thank you. You referred to the permit conditions, the proponents' Part A submission, and they have different permit numbers, condition numbers, sorry. I think they were in the 50s there, but are you aware of the DELP being the department, its version of conditions 29 to 31 in document 34? Have you seen that version of the permit conditions?
Is it possible to share that, and I can confirm
sure.
that the ones that we did?
I've done which version have I got here? I've done a quick scan. They seem to be just a copy and paste of one to the other. I just want to make sure that that's your understanding as well.
Thanks.
Or whether you have any issues. Here we go. Every time I try to click it, my computer jumps. Oh, here we go. I'll just share this. So if you have the other version in front of you, if you have access to it, or if you recall, just have a quick look at these 3 conditions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So certainly they look very good. I've certainly seen the correspondence from CFA, which were word for word in line with the conditions that I referenced, and certainly those conditions, the creation of the risk management plan, the fire management plan, the emergency management plan, is consistent. That certainly looks consistent with the ones that I indicated I'd reviewed.
Okay, thank you. In your discussions with CFA to date, and I know that you've been in discussion with them even as late as yesterday, is there anything which CFA has sought to include in the risk or fire management plan which you have opted not to include to date?
No. So certainly a very important part of the CFA guidelines process is to ensure that we engage regularly with CFA. So certainly we've undertaken a couple of engagements with CFA to, both with the client and both with ourselves, just to ensure that we've captured all of the particular elements and the design elements that we've been proposing, and certainly consistent with their guidelines. So at this stage, no, the indications from CFA they are satisfied that the design solution that we've provided is both consistent with their guidelines and their expectations based on the level of risk that's both within the landscape and within the equipment.
Thank you. And the last question is a matter of context and interest. Regarding your discussion with CFA, have they provided an indication whether they are trained and equipped to put out lithium battery storage of the scale proposed by this development?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question, Mr. Chair. So have they given us indications? So certainly by virtue of the request to provide a significant quantity of water, as I indicated, the 576,000 litres is considered certainly at the upper end when you assess that against the Australian standard for fire hydrant installations. So what that means is that the firefighters will be able to flow anything up to 40 litres a second for 4 hours duration is the quantity of water that's been supplied. Certainly CFA, based on their experiences at another fire in Victoria, and also their review of international fires within large-scale battery systems, is that they are aware that largely the treatment of those fires is to allow the lithium to burn out and to protect the exposures, and hence why there's such a large quantity of water supply that's required. So the recent, or the fire that occurred, I think last year in just out of Geelong, has triggered a number of design changes for a number of battery suppliers, and in particular around removal of combustible materials on the outside of battery enclosures, in particular around the vents, but also ensured that there's a much stronger focus on the communications monitoring of those systems from commissioning from day one, that they can actually, the control room or both at the site or remotely can clearly see the activities that occur. So, so certainly that you know, the strategies at this stage in our understanding is to protect exposures and allow the lithium to burn itself out is the strategy that most fire agencies across the world are utilising when they approach these fires.
All right, thank you, Mr. Potter. And thank you, Mr. Taylor. They're all the questions from the IAP. All other questions were answered. Do you have any re-examination, Mr. Power?
No re-examination from me, sir.
All right. Again, thank you to you both. We appreciate the insight today and the exploration of our questions. You may be excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Power, that brings us to the close of the experts that are listed today.
Yes, and as I mentioned yesterday, our next expert is on transport, who will call on Monday morning. And I'm hoping to have an opportunity, as I indicated, to spend just a bit of time elaborating on a couple of the matters raised in our Part B submissions and that have arisen during the course of this hearing in the afternoon. I might refer to a couple of documents which have come up and been referred to during this hearing, and I'll table them well in advance of Monday. And we'll also table the raw wind data that Ms. Tannick requested. The objective is to table that today. And I think there are two really outstanding issues arising from the examination of Chief of Mr. Burge and Ms. Tannick's comments this morning. One is the cross-examination, sorry. One is the reference that during his evidence to an earlier landscape and visual impact assessment report, we'll file that to PPV and the parties this afternoon. And I'll just get to the bottom of this photo montage of the Glares property, and if there is one, we'll also provide that. And I'll have to do that today. But otherwise, that's it from the proponent today, sir.
Mr. Powell, we'll look out for the photo montage. It may be something we've seen already, it might be something else. And subject to clarification from Mr. Houston, we may have some further data this afternoon, which probably make more sense to member West than anybody else in the IAP. Any other matters before we close for today and for the week, as we have tomorrow and Friday off?
The only question that I had really is for Mr. Power in the context of the information that he raised this morning in preliminary items in relation to the new regulations that have just been prepared, and the extent to which he's proposing to address those issues as part of his case. We're preparing our submissions for next week as well, and I'm just wanting to sort of understand whether you're going to address that before you close your case, or whether, given where it's at,
Yeah, no, fair question. No, I'm intending to address it during if the questioners of our transport witness give me a bit of time on Monday afternoon, fair question. I'm intending to address it then.
Okay.
Please don't ask me to address it today, Ms. Marshall, because I haven't really digested it yet. But yeah, absolutely, we'll deal with that. I think it's largely, I think the differences between the current regulations, the new regulations, and the old one largely relates to monitoring requirements, as I understand it. But I do need to check that, and I will address it.
Yes. The part that I haven't come to grips with yet is the published material says that it's addressed the Bald Hills decision, but I haven't quite worked out what that means. But anyway, it sounds like you will deal with it on Monday, and then I can deal with it in my submissions.
I'll certainly endeavour to do so.
Okay, that's good.
Well, if there's ever a time for new legislation to come in partway through a hearing, this is the good time, not later on. Because it provides parties with the opportunity to review it and understand what it means.
It does.
All right. I thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow, Friday. So wish you all a good weekend and look forward to seeing you Monday morning at 10 a.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.